Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric and our continuing series, Model Museum, where I take a look at and review every single Model 1, Model 2, and Model 3 arcade game ever made in a retrospective fashion, so long as it's not a racing game, because I did that retrospective last year. And today we're taking a look at Last Bronx. If you've already seen the video on Fighting Vipers, you know I wasn't a big fan of that game compared to Virtua Fighter 2. Last Bronx is way more to my liking. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. You'll see right off the top that the Last Bronx roster is not very big, as this is the first game in the series, and sadly it's the last game as well. Compared to Fighting Vipers that got a sequel, and obviously Virtua Fighter that got many, this is a standalone release for PC, Model 2, and Sega Saturn. And it's really disappointing to me that they never made another game in this franchise, because compared to Fighting Vipers, I much would have rather seen a Last Bronx 2. But this game, compared to something like Virtua Fighter, is a weapons-based combat game. Of course, it still plays similar to Virtua Fighter because it is made by Sega, but this is made by the Virtual On team that made that game for Model 2, so it is a different development team inside of Sega, and this was their first fighting game. And I just love what they did with it. The weapons make contextual sense, and of course you still have those kicks because you do not have weapons on your feet. So it plays similar to a Virtua Fighter or a Tekken or a Street Fighter EX, but your reach and range of motion is definitely increased on the top because those weapons have a much longer reach than just your fist. You still get the same grapple system, you still get the same kind of inputs and control scheme as a Virtua Fighter, you just happen to have weapons along for the ride with you. But basically, this game is just Virtua Fighter weapons based, and it 100% works. And in developer interviews, they said that they modeled the characters after what was Tokyo street fashion at the time. I didn't look up any photos, and I'm sure that that fashion has not aged very well, but this game screams pure 90s from a clothing and aesthetic standpoint. And compared to something like Fighting Vipers or Virtua Fighter 2, this game is grittier and darker. A lot of the rounds take place at night in these stages. You're in the cityscape on a heliport pad, and everything is dark around you, and that was unique for Sega because they almost always went with those bright, vibrant colors and that Sega blue sky in the background. But the darker colorways 100% work for the tone of Last Bronx, and so do all of the characters. There's so many different options to choose from. You have your heavies, your mediums, and your lightweight characters, and they all have a new and unique moveset that's different than something like Virtua Fighter. If you are good at Virtua Fighter, you're definitely going to be able to pick up and play this game easier, but just because you know everything from start to finish about a Virtua Fighter game does not mean it is all going to translate over to the Last Bronx. And I love the replay camera as well. It does take a different angle than you're normally seeing in Sega's other fighting games. But as we move underground here, the Model 2 does such interesting things with the graphical look with that infinite floor, and you will see those old school CRTs on the television above you. You will see that it says Act Against AIDS in the background, which is a kind of interesting thing to have up on an arcade game, and that was removed for the home release. I think it would have been totally fine to keep, and I was curious why that ended up in there, but that's an interesting observation from the time and place. Now moving over to the Sega Saturn version, because I don't want to show footage from that. This is one of the best Model 2 ports, in my opinion, on the system. Sure, it runs in interlace mode, but it does run in 60 frames a second, and it brings so much of the spirit of Last Bronx home to the Saturn. And apparently this was a lot of the developers' first Saturn game, and they 100% killed it, because there's definitely a lot worse ports on the system, and I would say the developers are more accurately able to translate what Last Bronx was on Model 2 to the Saturn than the Virtua Fighter team was able to do so. That's just my opinion, but leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think. And also tell me if you ever saw a cabinet for this in North America, because I will tell you right now, I never did. This game was apparently a failure in North America, but big in Japan, and I have seen one since the release, but when this game was new on arcade floors, I never saw one. I saw one in maybe like 2004 or 2005 in a hotel in Colorado. But I 100% bought the Sega Saturn game back in the day, fell in love with it, and I've been playing it ever since. Now, of course, like any fighting game, this is definitely going to be a lot better when you have a human opponent next to you, but the CPU definitely by stage 5 decides that it just wants to take all of your quarters. Sure, if you practice, you'll get better, but it's always more fun to play with friends. The other thing about this game that I really like is the soundtrack, because it's not as bright and cheery as normal. Go ahead and listen, I'll be right back. It's just a way grittier soundtrack than we're used to in a Sega fighting game, and that's just because all around this is a little bit grittier. That's not to say that it's really dark whatsoever outside of the color. It's still a bright and vibrant game for the character models. It still has that Sega look and charm to it. It's just doing it in a completely different manner. But honestly, this game is just a ton of fun. They definitely still played around with the camera angles just like they did in Fighting Vipers 2, but that is just Sega. But moving over to the Sega Saturn version, I will say that even though I play them both on normal, for some reason the Sega Saturn version just always feels easier. 9 times out of 10 when I play that version, I can see the end of the game. When I play the Model 2 version, it's like 5 out of 10 times that I can actually get past the final boss, because that stage 5 barrier is a real thing. It seems like the AI at that point in time is way more predictive, and it wants you to put more quarters into the machine so you can see the next stage. But of course it is an arcade game. They are there to make money continually, so you can't really fault it for that. But that's the fun thing about this, is you get options to play it. The Model 2 version obviously looks the best out of these two, but because the Sega Saturn version has the gameplay intact and it runs at 60 frames per second, it is also an awesome option to be able to have. And of course, if you want to buy one of the two versions of it, Last Bronx on Sega Saturn is going to be a lot cheaper than buying a Model 3 arcade board. Let alone talking about how to set that up, they are not easy. And if you put them side by side, you can see a lot of the differences. On the left with Model 2, the entire background is made out of 3D polygons, where on the right it has all been converted back into background layers or sprites. But they did a really good job with the perspective. You honestly can't tell too much that they have done that until you kind of see the Model 2 in full screen, and you can definitely tell those buildings are made out of those polygons. But Last Bronx is just got everything going for it. The combat is fast and effective, the weapons are new and fresh for Sega, and of course graphically and stylistically it is such a good game to look at. But I'm going to give you one more taste of the soundtrack, because I think as far as Model 2 fighting games are concerned, this one is my favorite. Go ahead and listen, and I'll be right back. Just a jazzy good time, and that's what I love about the soundtrack so much. It does really pivot itself up. This kind of feels like, in a way, Sega's answer to something like Soul Edge or Soul Calibur from Namco, obviously Soul Edge being the game that came out the year before, because weapons-based fighters were getting really popular. And this series is very popular in Japan and was after the release. There's comic books, there's mangas, there's animes, but we didn't get any of that in the West. The only thing we never really did get was more Last Bronx, which is 100% a disappointment. You can understand that anime influence, because if we go over to the Sega Saturn version one more time, something the Model 2 is obviously lacking. It has a full motion video intro that is a really good and effective look at the characters and kind of some of their motivations in the game. It's just not something that you're going to get on Model 2, because Model 2 did not have the ability to show these full motion videos like the Sega Saturn did with the compact disc medium. But the thing about Last Bronx is, it's just a great time, and it's not one of those games that you hear mentioned near as much as Fighting Vipers or definitely Virtua Fighter, and I'm not sure why that is. Maybe just because it didn't really succeed in North America compared to that it did in Japan, because I think this is every bit as good as some of Sega's best 3D fighting games of all time. It's got everything I need. Fast and fluid combat, it's got awesome graphics and character models, and an amazing soundtrack, and when you bring some friends to game night, crack open a few beers, it becomes even better. I mean, honestly, what more could you ask for out of a fighting game from Sega? It is just that good, and I always love the animations as well. All of the character models are fast and fluid, and apparently, and I cannot find a version of it, so if you know of one, let me know if you got a link. There is a VHS tape that talks about the motion capture behind this game and the actors and performers that did it. I would actually love to see that, because I do think that this game has some of the best and most fluid animations Sega's ever put to a 3D fighting game before the year 2000. But yeah, Last Bronx, it is just an absolute masterpiece of a game. I give it a straight 10 out of 10, and that's not just from nostalgia. But I am curious if you played this game before. Leave me a comment down below and tell me if you played it on Saturn, if you played it on Model 2, or if you've never played it whatsoever. But however you decide to play this game, definitely check it out or play it again, because it is that good. Short of that, that's the Last Bronx. I love it, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.